Hey guys, so today I'd like to talk about a little sword physics misconception which I haven't heard too many times, but I have heard enough that it warrants making a video about, and that is the idea that having a thicker, heavier guard will improve the handling of a blade. And the basic argument is that, say this is the centre of gravity or the point of balance, whatever you want to call it, if you have a thicker, heavier guard, it's going to bring the centre of gravity close to the hilt and therefore make the sword rotate more easily like that and handle better. And this is absolute nonsense. I'll get to exactly why this is and show some little physics simulations and that kind of thing. But before that, I'd like to just talk about some of the potential benefits of having a larger guard and some other aspects of sword handling and that kind of thing. So, first off, yeah, if your guard is wider, it's going to protect a wider area. If it's thicker, it's going to be able to take more abuse without snapping and that kind of thing. It's also going to do more damage if you do a murder stroke, regardless of whether you hit with the guard or the pommel. You've still got a lot more mass in that area, so it's going to do more damage. So there are some potential benefits of having a thicker, heavier guard. Subjectively, it could also bring the point of inertia close to where you want it. So what the point of inertia is the point at which the sword naturally wants to rotate. So if I waggle the sword backwards and forwards, once I get it to the right speed, you should see there's a point which ends up staying quite stationary, and that is the point of inertia. Where you want that point to be will depend on what style you're using and what you want to actually be doing with the sword. So for example, with a rapier, you want the point of inertia to be a lot further down the blade so that the point stays on line regardless of whether you move it. If the point of inertia was closer, what you'd end up finding is that the point just wobbles all over the place, and even if you're actively trying to keep it online, it's still going to be a lot harder to control than if the point of inertia was further down the blade. But with different styles and doing different things, perhaps you want it close to the blade. So if I'm in an outside guard and I want to switch to a hanging, for example, having the point of inertia close to the hilt will potentially make me quicker to get into the guard and that kind of thing. So yeah, there is a potential subjective benefit to having a thicker, heavier guard when it comes to that, but even so, I find that to be a very, very inefficient way of doing things. You may have to add 100 grams to the weight of the crossguard rather than adding 10 grams to the weight of the pommel, or increasing the taper ever so slightly on the blade to have the same effect. You're going to have to take far more drastic measures with the crossguard to have the same effect as you would simply by manipulating the geometry of the blade or the mass of the pommel. So even in that respect, I think having a thicker, heavier guard is a very silly way of going things about it from a sword maker's point of view. And yeah, adding that much extra mass will have a pretty drastic impact when it comes to fatiguing hanging guards or even a fool's guard. So in those kind of positions, it is purely the weight of the blade which matters and not the distribution of mass or any of those kind of things. So now that's out the way, let's talk a little bit about how the weight of a crossguard is going to impact the torque, centre of gravity, and those kind of things. So what we have here is a simulation of the weight and balance of a sword and how the guard will affect that. So we're starting off with the guard weighing 100 grams. The blade grip and pommel weigh 1,000 grams, so everything except the guard there, and that brings our total mass to 1,100 grams. The point of balance is 22.72 centimetres, and that probably seems really excessive if you've ever bought a real sword. You know, you'd normally be looking at, say, 12 centimetres, but there is a good reason for that, and that is when you buy a sword, The balance is talked about in relation to the hilt, so it may say 12 centimetres, and that's 12 centimetres from the hilt, so you're looking at round about this sort of mark here. In this simulation, however, I'm talking about the balance in relation to about here. I'm taking that as the pivot point, and that's roughly where your wrist's going to be. Now, in the real world, things are going to get a bit more messy and complicated than that. The wrist isn't the only joint being used in the movement, but it is often the limiting factor, so that's why I'm taking the wrist as the pivot point here. And that is going to work out to 12.72 centimetres if we actually take it from the hilt instead. And finally, we have the torque or leverage, and it is 250 gram meters. So for those of you who don't know, that's basically equivalent to having a meter long weightless stick, holding it at one end and putting a 250 gram weight at the end of it. So yeah, that's what that means, or it's equivalent to a 50 centimeter stick with 500 grams, or 25 centimeter stick with 1000 grams. So how you calculate that is you take the total mass, in this case 1100 grams, and you multiply that by where the force is being applied, so 22.72 centimeters or 0.2272 meters, and that will give you 250 gram meters. Yeah, that's the total amount of torque there. And let's have a look at how the guard will affect that. So if we make the guard smaller and smaller until it just disappears completely, we can see that the point of balance is 24 centimeters and the torque is 250 gram meters. If we increase that, you can see that the point of balance is slowly coming further and further towards the pivot point, but the amount of torque is actually increasing. So now we've got the guard at 800 grams, we have 320 gram meters, so what's that, 40% more? Oh, I can't even bother to work it out now, but the amount of torque is increasing, the point of balance is decreasing. So why is that? You'd have thought that bringing the balance closer is going to mean there's going to be less torque, and the simple reason is what's happening is you're adding two forces together. We take the if we get rid of the guard completely, we have 240 gram meters being applied from everything except the guard. That isn't going to change. The point of balance of this system and the weight of this system isn't going to change. So that 250 gram meters, that is going to stay the same. And the effect of the guard is simply going to have an additional effect to it. And since the guard is past the point of the pivot, pivot point, it's always going to increase the amount of torque added, and the heavier it is, the more force it's going to apply. So why is that changing the point of balance? Effectively, you're averaging two things there. So if the pivot point's here, the heavier you make the guard, the more it's going to bring the pivot point towards the hilt there. Effectively, you're averaging 2 points. It's like saying, if you take a guy who can bench press 100 kilos and you take another guy who can bench press 50 kilos, you take a guy of a bench press of 100 kilos, the average of that one person is 100 kilos. You add a person with a 50 kilo bench press and you take the average, that's going to be 75 kilos. So the average is decreasing, but since you're adding both of them together, the total is increasing. So that's what we're actually seeing here. We're adding two forces together. We're adding the torque which the crossguard will give, and we're adding the effect which the blade and everything else is going to give. So basically add them together and it will give you the force in gram meters. Finally, there's another physics misconception I'd like to address, and that is the idea that if you know the balance point of a sword and you know the weight of a sword, you can predict exactly how it's going to handle. And it's a pretty good proxy in a lot of cases, but it really doesn't tell you the whole story. Now, this may seem to contradict what I was saying a moment ago, but it really doesn't. If you're adding more mass beyond the pivot point, it's always going to require more force to accelerate and decelerate it. That isn't going to be escaped, but it just means that the real world is going to be a bit more complicated than that. So what we've got here, we have two weights. Both of them are exactly the same weight, they're both exactly the same length, and they both have a centre of gravity in the middle, and that's exactly where they're rotating. So this is an analogue for the idea that if you know the balance point and the weight of the sword, you know how it's going to handle. That simply isn't true. So we can see here that the weight is distributed completely differently, and the weight on the right, with all of the weight towards the end, is simply going to require a hell of a lot more force to accelerate and decelerate it than the one on the left, where the weight is distributed towards the centre. So if you have a sword with a heavy pommel and a lot of mass towards the end of the blade, it could have exactly the same weight and exactly the same balance as a sword which is just very nicely tapered, but they could behave completely differently simply due to how the weight is distributed. So yeah, that's all I've got to say for now. Thanks for watching. Comment, rate, subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.